Australian Craniofacial Unit is a standalone multidisciplinary unit. By multidisciplinary I mean that it's got lots of specialists, not only the surgeons who do the craniofacial surgery, but brain surgeons and eye surgeons and ENT surgeons, social workers, neuropsychologists, speech therapists, very specialist nurses, and a lot of other major professionals, all of whom are focused on managing children really from before birth, diagnosed by ultrasound, right through to maturity, adulthood and beyond, who suffer from major deformities of their skulls and faces. This model of surgery was first proposed by a Frenchman back in the 1960s. Not very well developed by him, but the next generation of his surgical children, as it were, which I'm one, developed the whole idea of focusing on the patient, having all of the people around the patient, as it were, to organise how their treatment might be for many, many years. This is the very best model, and it's proven to be so. Because if you look at the literature and our own experience, and ours is now over 40 years, you can see that once upon a time, as it were, these people suffered mightily from not being able to join in the mainstream of society. They were not able to be well educated. Some of them were even put away into madhouses and sequestered away out of sight and mind. So what we now have is children, adolescents, adults who have a full and complete life. They can go to university, they can play sport, they can marry, they can do all of the things that we would expect of one of our children. And that comes about because of organisation really, and not only individual expertise, but the way in which that expertise is collected, organised and delivered to the patients. And it doesn't take too much imagination to really understand that when you do this and you see a critical number of patients of what are otherwise rare diseases, this critical number enables you to understand more about the disease process, understands the potential for the patients, and in modern healthcare parlance, you can measure the outcomes. You can really see what it is you achieve, rather than some person in an isolated fashion saying, oh, I'd like to do that, or let's see what happens, or this is a trophy case, this is something that's would be good if it succeeded, but I'm not quite sure I know how, and that sort of thing. We're well beyond that these days. We don't know everything about the diseases that we treat, but we know a lot more than we used to. And the reason for that is we see a critical number of patients, we have a critical multidisciplinary treatment and management team, and we do the science that goes along with this, constantly criticising ourselves and making things better. And then, in the modern world, which is what I'm doing here today, in the modern world, we now reach right out to the patient through the social media. The patients are the most important people, their families are the most important people, and we can now relate in a particular way to families via social media so that they can truly understand what is available, and they can truly understand that there is hope and light at the end of what might sometimes seem to be a very dark tunnel. Well, plastic surgery is a name that was derived long time ago, and particularly came into parlance in the 19th century, and it comes from a Greek word called plastikos, which means to mould or to shape. Now, unfortunately, that word has been has become a derogatory term in some ways, meaning superficial, cosmetic in a very superficial fashion, and associated with various sorts of non-urgent surgery. Now, craniofacial surgery is quite different from this. The original craniofacial surgeon and surgeons were trained in plastic surgery. Some these days are not. They come from other disciplines, oral and maxillofacial surgery and neurosurgery. But craniofacial surgery is dealing with severe deformities of the craniofacial skeleton. Now, of course, some of this involves appearance, but it's very profound in that it means altering the skeleton, the skull, the eye sockets, the face, the jaws, etc. And whilst the origin might have been with a plastic surgical training, which is a very good one, it has now grown well beyond that. And if you think about it in very real terms, perhaps the greatest progenitor of it was World War One, where people put their heads up out of the trenches and had massive, extraordinary trauma to their heads and faces, and out of that grew a certain aspect of plastic surgery, and then out of that grew the very complex attention to the details that can repair that sort of deformity. It weakens a muscle, so it stops people having lines or spasms. But Parry-Romberg's disease is a progressive atrophy of skin, fat, muscle and bone, and we're not quite sure why that happens. There are a number of theories about it, but it is progressive. Sometimes it starts early, sometimes it starts later. Sometimes the progress, if it starts early, affects the underlying bone because the muscles aren't working. So it can be quite complex, and it also has manifestations inside with blood vessels and with neurological development inside the brain. So there are other manifestations of this. It is a disease process which is quite difficult to understand. It does burn out, and the time to treat it effectively is when it is burnt out. Otherwise, replacement therapies, etc., just look and function very badly. Mm. And no, there is no interesting case, if you see what I mean. It's just the most interesting thing is how the process has been. We've got literally thousands of patients now who've succeeded, but the successes vary. They are the human outcomes that are most successful. They are the people who otherwise would not have been able to assume a normal place in life. And I wouldn't like to single out any single one of them.
Oh, I just thought you might have a...
Well, this is very important, that patients need to have a role. Now, whether they advocate for a particular system or not is their business. This is the important thing is that without fear or favour, we inform them of what's available, and if they choose not to go in that direction, or they have other information, then we shouldn't in any way militate against them. And it's very important that patients be given all the information that's available and be treated with great respect no matter what decisions they make about it. And in that context, I have a great faith in our society and human beings that they themselves will assert and exercise the sorts of pressures that are necessary ultimately to be able to acquire the management programs that they need.
What I meant by advocating is that after the
issue about this is that that's what we always should be doing. It has been one of the downsides of technical medicine, I suppose, is that there's an over-focus on techniques, and we've got away from looking at the people who actually are suffering with the problems. And that's the idea of having a big team, so that if one person misses out or over-focuses on one thing, then another member of the team can pick up the deficit and attend to that. The important thing for the outcome is not a small technical advance, even if it's a big technical advance, but the patients must be better off and happier. The things I think that it's important for people to interact with our profession is to really know what's available, and to demand to know what's available. The literature is there and it's full of information, and they need to be very careful about the sort of information that they get from the multiple sources on the media. But if it is filtered properly and if it is cross-checked with appropriate professionals, then we should be able to get the information we want. And for things like craniofacial anomalies and the surgical management of them, then we need to make sure that our healthcare systems and our government, etc., doesn't have unnecessary reduplication, that we do focus these things in this care in the appropriate way, that we have critical patient load, and that the outcomes are properly measured. Yes, that's correct. We've trained in our unit, and that's one of the other aspects I haven't mentioned, is that when you have a critical number of people in a unit that does nothing else but this, then you're in a position to train other people. And we have trained people who are now preeminent in other craniofacial units in Britain, Europe, America and Southeast Asia.